What if the most haunted house in Louisiana isn't haunted by ghosts, but by historical trauma? In 1834, firefighters broke into a burning New Orleans mansion and uncovered something so disturbing it horrified an entire city. The woman responsible vanished in the middle of the night, but the house itself never let go. Tonight, we're stepping inside the LaLaurie Mansion, and the truth behind the legend itself is worse than the haunting.
Welcome to ParaTruth.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of ParaTruth Reborn. We are live on 107.7 FM in New Orleans, 105.3 FM on the Gulf Coast, and of course, the United Public Radio Network. My name is Erik.
And I'm Justin.
Now, there are plenty of locations throughout America that battle for the top spot of most haunted, but two of those locations reside in Louisiana. And to this day, it's a toss-up between which is most haunted within the state. The first, of course, is the Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, which we will certainly be covering in a future episode. But the second, which we're discussing today, is the infamous LaLaurie Mansion in New Orleans. Now, Justin and I have had the opportunity to travel to New Orleans and visit this mansion and hear the ghost tales behind it. It was a fun, relatively spooky and spectacular night in learning about its history. But I will tell you that even on the ghost tours, the history they give you isn't nearly as deep as the truth itself. But Justin, before we kind of get into the show, like, what were some of your experiences when we visited this location?
I mean, to be fair, it was a ghost tour. We were all just a little bit intoxicated, but I think I really didn't feel anything until we walked up, got the opportunity to walk up to it and touch it. Not any like feelings of dread or anything like that. A little bit of heaviness. But we also didn't get a chance to actually go inside. It was limited to just the outside. And we did take some photos to try and see if we captured anything. The one thing that we caught, we had debunked right away because there was security cameras there, and there was like this orb that we saw, but then it's like, no, there's a camera there, so that's just the AR or infrared,
The IR.
Light from that. So I would love to do an investigation there, but
Sure.
had you ever heard of the LaLaurie Mansion before we went there?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's truly both infamous and famous in its own right, both in the historical context, through Spanish colonial Louisiana, but also just with the years upon years of storytelling regarding the mansion and the hauntings there within. So it's definitely come up, and of course, many of you know that I've been to New Orleans 3 or 4 times now. I was down there on missions for after Katrina, doing a lot of cleanup and work down there, demolition, things like that. But then going back down again last year, it was October 2024 that you and I went with your wife, and that was
Technically 2 years now.
has it been 2 years now?
It's 2026, buddy.
2026, yeah. So I think it's 2025. Well, yeah, but yes, but back in October 2024, it was my first time really getting a chance to explore the area, just go out and relax and enjoy it, take it all in. It's a little easier to do that, obviously, when you're not working.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there's been a lot of experiences down there, and of course, some of the most interesting and fun things to do is explore the ghost side of it, the paranormal, right? The ghosts, the vampires, uh, so on and so forth. And for many of you listening right now, obviously tuning in New Orleans, you guys are very well acquainted with the LaLaurie Mansion and probably have visited yourself multiple times, maybe even stayed there. So if you have any of your own stories, anything you witnessed, experienced while you were there, we'd love to hear about it. Feel free to hit us up on this YouTube channel or in the chat anywhere. You can also email us. We'd love to hear from you. Now, Justin and I, we kind of split this up a little bit. We did research in a different way this week. So I want to kind of throw some questions over to you, Justin, because you've kind of dove into this a little differently. But why is the LaLaurie Mansion considered one of the most haunted homes in Louisiana?
Well, I mean, and see, my knowledge of the LaLaurie Mansion came originally from American Horror Story. That's where I kind of first heard of it. I might have heard of it well before then, but it didn't like ring any bells on that. So to see what a lot of the research was showing through fiction was pretty disturbing in itself. But it's considered one of the most haunted places in Louisiana due to the horrific torture and abuse of slaves uh, by Madame Delphine LaLaurie, which culminated in a fire which was set to the home in 1834 and revealing a gruesome discovery in the attic of the home. It's since then been reported that the home is filled with the spirits of whom witnesses claim you can, on occasion, hear the screams as well. Uh, it has also been reported that there have been numerous sightings of apparitions and odd physical sensations within the home, as well as reports of a dark entity, which was first acknowledged in 1894 by a tenant who was living uh, in the converted apartments, then converted apartments, who was brutally murdered. The tenant, prior to his death, had shared with a friend that he had believed he was being haunted by a demon that wouldn't rest until the tenant was dead. Or, now, we've talked about a similar situation that you had with a client die, but just tormented by something there. Uh, so this one is kind of really near and dear to my heart because it is there's very similarities in many stories, but just the fact that we know of someone who was kind of going through
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else. I hope everyone else is hearing Justin clearly, but I know you're extremely muffled on my end again here, and I don't know if it's your distance from the microphone or if it's the connection again. Um, but if you guys in the chat, you guys let us know what you hear. If anything sounds amiss, let us know, please, so we can fix that ASAP.
I'll start fixing it right now. Hang on.
Sounds good right there. It could be just you guys know how technical difficulties are with these podcasts. It's always a little frustrating.
I did turn the volume up a little bit too. Is that better?
That's much better,
Okay.
at least on my end.
Well, if it's too loud on the audio side, we'll kind of work with it here.
Yeah. So for those of you who maybe if Justin was a little bit muffled and really hard to hear, I just want to give a quick kind of little synopsis of what he was saying. Basically, it's really just one of the most haunted places in Louisiana due to the horrific torture and abuse of the enslaved people by Madame Delphine LaLaurie, which culminated in the a fire which was set to the home in 1834. And there was this just gruesome findings in the attic of the home upon this fire after it broke out. There were reports that the home was basically riddled with tortured spirits of whom witnesses claim you can see on occasion and hear the screams of. And there's also been reported that there have been numerous sightings and apparitions of various odd physical sensations within the home, as well as reports of a dark entity, many of which have claimed it to be a demon since 1894. Now, and one person in particular even died supposedly by the hands of this demon, who he claimed wouldn't rest until he, the tenant, met his end. Now, you had mentioned, Justin, at the beginning here a little bit about your real first introduction to the LaLaurie mansion, and that was through American Horror Story. So, one thing that we notice within the paranormal, and we talk about this type of thing here and there throughout the lifespan of our show, but the media tends to stretch things a bit in terms of the truth. So when we think of media, we think of pop culture. And so my question is, how has pop culture shaped the modern myth of the LaLaurie mansion?
Well, the one first and foremost, the first thing I really have to say about them stretching the truth is, although they do that, it does get people interested in it. So, and that's what really interested me in the LaLaurie Mansion. But pop culture, I mean, shaped the LaLaurie Mansion haunting in significant proportions. Not only have the hauntings been perpetuated by ghost tours and general tourism, but it has been established as a focal point of supernatural storytelling since 1880s. I do believe there was even a video game made about Madame Delphine. Many of those stories, however, became exaggerated over time, predominantly extending the fact of finding seven mutilated slaves. God, I cannot talk tonight. Within the home to pop culture narrative claiming hundreds of victims or very specific, gruesome, and unverified acts, which transferred the lore of the home. On
Mhm.
top of that, the home, like I mentioned, was a central character in the show American Horror Story. Season was Coven in 2013, and cemented the attic torture chamber and popularized the fictional rivalry between LaLaurie and Marie Laveau.
Mm.
Now, we've kind of mentioned Marie Laveau before. Um, just to give just a very brief, if you're in Louisiana, I apologize. I know you already know a lot of this, but Marie Laveau was a voodoo priestess. Some call her the voodoo queen of New Orleans. Um, and there's a lot of history to it, but they thought she lived for over hundreds of years. But it was actually Marie Laveau and then her daughter took over the role afterwards, still calling herself Marie Laveau to give the illusion that she was immortal.
Interesting. It's like just a little bit of hocus pocus, if you will, and make people think something that isn't really true.
Yeah.
Uh, we see that a lot throughout history too. Just people who take on the name of their respected parent, maybe not necessarily to make that person seem to live longer than a normal person would, but the stories of individuals who share the same name one generation after the next kind of expand to this almost immortality like nature within the stories of these individuals, especially those who are famous.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Now, so this was basically how pop culture more or less influenced the modern myth. But what do people tend to think happened at the mansion itself? Like if you were to ask just a random person on the street, what is most likely something they would consider uh, when talking about the mansion?
Well, I mean, there's a few rumors that have spread over the years, leading many to believe the tales that are told. For example, some people believe that during the fire, the slaves were falling from the third floor of the home. However, the third floor didn't exist in 1834. Instead, the mansion was a two-story home with a peaked roof. It was also believed that upon further investigation after the fire, authorities found a buried burial ground on the property where they found numerous bodies, including the body of a child. However, in reality, there was no burial ground found, not any bodies found, and the property on the property. In fact, the closest cemetery was across the street from the LaLaurie Mansion and was owned by Ursuline nuns. Now, today, there is no cemetery by the house. It's been populated and built over.
Hmm. But I think a lot of people tend to get that, tend to be mistaken when it comes to those certain things because they think of the original context of the area, the original layout, and these are the cemetery across the street, and so people naturally think, oh, cemetery, mansion, horrific events. They
Right.
found this cemetery on the mansion in the courtyard in particular, which just was never the case. And I think that's a lot of what I think is important when it comes to these stories. It's fun to enjoy the idea of the fabrications, but the more we kind of dive into the fabrications and accept them, the further away from the truth we get of the original story and the full context of the haunting, which I think, at least in my opinion, I think it discredits a lot of the lives lost there during the years that the mansion was, I'll say in its heyday, back in its prime.
Right. Well, and like we mentioned earlier, there was only 7 slaves that were killed there. Now that's still a lot for back then. And in this particular day and age, that would make her a serial killer.
Mhm.
But if there was a cemetery across the street, and people found out about this story, that's where the rumors fly, and just the fact that it was next to a cemetery would have perpetuated the rumor that there was actually burials on the property itself.
Right.
Because back then it was a huge property. It wasn't this small thing that it is today.
Mm.
And by small thing, I mean more property there than what is the house is sitting
Right.
on. Now, we're talking about Madame LaLaurie. Um, this is her home, but who was she socially compared to privately?
Yeah. So in public, she was described as a gracious and even captivating woman. In fact, people often mentioned how she was very polite, both in general to strangers, but also to the slaves in her care. Privately, however, if you guys don't know the story already from what we've already shared, she was quite the opposite. She was cruel and secretly engaged in sadistic torture and even murder of the enslaved people that were in her care.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, slavery was bad in and of itself, but
Mhm.
to add that torture to it just e- made it even more dehumanizing to the slaves.
Right.
Um, Now, what was her public reputation and wealth?
So, yeah, so Madame Little was born into a wealthy and well-connected family. Uh, she was brought into this life as Marie Delphine McCarty on March 19th of 1787 in New Orleans, which was then Spanish colonial Louisiana. A quick little interesting note I would like to add here is that her cousin Augustine D. McCarty or Day McCarty was actually mayor of New Orleans from September of 1850 to May of 1920. I think unless I might have mixed those two numbers up, 1820 to 1850, I believe, May 1850. Dyslexia, you know how it is.
Well, and that's one thing that they didn't put in pop culture, especially the American horror stories, is it was just she was a wealthy, well-known uh,
Right.
person.
Right. Well, and a lot of that wealth, I mean, despite being born into the family, she also married 3 times, just kind of added to her well connectedness. So the first marriage that she had was to Don Ramon de Lopez y Angelo in 1800, and the second time was to Jean Blanc, I believe is how the last name was pronounced, and that's the last name that she's typically known by the way. That's her primary name. It's what most people know her by even today. LaLaurie was her third marriage, um, and that was to Dr. Leonard Louise Nicolas LaLaurie in 1825. With each of these marriages increasing her status and wealth. It's also, I'm going to add here that her 2 first marriages, she ended up as a widow in both of them, as both of her husbands passed away relatively young, which is, you know, in my opinion, a little questionable considering we know what her history ended up, uh, you know, being like. So,
And that would have added to her wealth as well at that time.
right, absolutely. And so, with those 3 marriages and the way that her status kind of increased with each one, the simple fact was that she was a fixture of the upper class and was known even for hosting lavish parties despite the rumors of her cruelty. Which there were. A lot of people think nobody knew of her cruelty, but there were rumors spreading.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, in high society, that is the big thing is rumors and gossip. So
Right.
yeah, nothing has changed in almost two or over 200 years, almost 200
Right.
years. Um, Now, what were the early warning signs that neighbors ignored?
Well, so some of the warning signs early on were actually pretty numerous. According to historian Carolyn Morrow Long, LaLaurie was actually investigated in 1828 for cruelty toward some of her enslaved people, the result of which actually led to her forcibly selling several of those people while also paying for legal services. And then neighbors and residents also reportedly witnessed that some of her enslaved workers were appearing malnourished and even frail. Then, of course, there was an incident in which a young slave girl fell to her death, uh, supposedly from the roof of the house, in an attempt to escape from the mansion after La Laurie became enraged toward her. There's a few different beliefs as to how or why she was enraged toward this slave girl. But one of the most leading beliefs is that the slave girl was doing Delphine's hair, and whatever happened, she became enraged and was trying to harm her. So this poor girl fell from the roof, supposedly. And then in 1833, there was another neighbor who witnessed Delphine's cruelty, which again led to yet another investigation, which in this case forced her to forfeit 9 enslaved people who were under her care, whom, by way of cheating the system, she had actually sold to a relative and then eventually bought back from said relative.
Well, and the in spoiler alert, if you haven't seen American Horror Story, cover your ears. In American Horror Story, the girl that fell from the balcony was actually perpetuated as a suicide.
Mm.
The story was that the slave was gave birth to a boy who was actually fathered by her husband, and Lalaurie supposedly kills the baby for his blood. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit because it's what's in Coven is kind of a mixture of two historical characters, I believe.
Okay. Well, and speaking of the idea of suicide, we can't really put it past some individuals who actually choose suicide over the constant torture and abuse that
Oh, for
these
sure.
in particular people were suffering on a regular basis, I'd imagine. And that kind of leads us up to the fire of 1834, where things kind of accumulated. So, like, what exactly, if you can tell us, Justin, what exactly caused the fire itself?
Well, the fire was actually deliberate. It was set on April 10th, 1834, by a 70-year-old slave cook who was desperately trying to escape the extreme torture and abuse that LaLaurie and other or that she, sorry, the slave, and other enslaved people of the home were constantly, victims of La Laurie. Supposedly, rescuers who entered the home, however, after quenching the fire, found the cook chained to the stove. Now, I could not foresee someone setting a fire and chaining themselves to a stove to escape torture. I feel you would set the fire and flee so that the person that was doing the torturing was killed, not yourself. But again, I have never been through that. So, like you'd mentioned,
Well,
people would have been desperate to get away from that torture, no matter the cost.
yeah. Well, so the big thing about Delphine is that is plenty of lore that claims that she had actually chained her slave people to the areas in which they were working. So in this case, she chained the 70-year-old cook to the stove in order to get the work done and make sure she didn't flee. And that's why she was found in chains. She'd rather set the fire and hope to break free, maybe didn't, or just chose, a different way out altogether. But that's something else that we actually learn about a little bit later on, because eventually rescuers do discover something very, very scary that kind of adds to this whole idea of using chains and whatnot. So, what exactly did the rescuers find once they kind of walked into this house upon quenching the flames?
Well, other than the cook, who was chained to the stove, of course, they also found a torture chamber in the attic of the home, which was technically on the second floor of the home, because they didn't add the third floor till later. And they found at least 7 more enslaved people chained to the walls or the floors who had been brutally tortured and mutilated.
Mhm. And so, and one thing I'd like to know, Eric, because the stories are very particular in the brutality and the gruesomeness here. But there have been claims that the first responders at the time, and mind you, like most people, nowadays we think of first responders, they're many of them, especially you think of like EMTs and stuff, are accustomed to seeing some pretty grotesque things,
Mhm.
things that shouldn't bother them too much because they technically become desensitized to it. Most of them do, I should say. But in this particular instance, the first responders were pretty shaken. And it had to do with a little more than just finding some people who happened to be chained to the walls or floors and appear to be brutally tortured. There's more details. So, what exactly happened, or what did they find that actually shook these people so much?
All right. Well, and this is just kind of a disclaimer alert, trigger warning. If this stuff does not sit right with you, or you don't like hearing it, please just, mute for now, and or close your ears, and I'll give you guys a second to do that. Okay. According to the legend, when they stepped foot into the attic, rescuers found what was supposedly stated to be a scene beyond their darkest nightmares. Now, take that in for a second. Eh, We can imagine a lot of stuff in this day and age. Back then, things were a little bit more sensitive. And when you came across something that was so horrific, a lot of times, and this is going back to when, many more people were much more religious than we are today. Um, so just take that into effect. Um, the legend details 7 or more enslaved individuals who were either chained to the floor, the wall, or within dog cage like structures. And this is kind of done in coven. So
Okay.
it's interesting to see that the history is not far off from the fiction there. The individuals were covered in scars or open wounds, some of which were disfigured beyond recognition, and wearing spiked iron collars. Now we know from even further in the past, devices like that were used for torture devices throughout history.
Mhm.
Um, they had broken bones reset at extreme or unnatural angles, giving some victims a crab like appearance, which is just disturbing.
Yeah.
And several victims were severely emaciated and starved, and even had been had their mouths sewn shut. Uh, However, it is important to note that despite the historical fact that rescuers uncovered a torture chamber in LaLaurie's attic and the exact detail of the victims may be exaggerated a little bit
Yeah.
in the retellings.
Right. And beyond all of that, there were at least one or two people that were supposedly already deceased by the time they had walked in, the first responders. And we'll get a little bit into some of these later retellings, not the retellings themselves, but why that is. But it's just, wild to me to think, like, by far one of the most disturbing things here is the fact that they had these people in dog cage like structures and would purposely break their bones and reset them uh, in weird angles that basically had these poor individuals looking like crabs in a way. Like I mean, I'm a very imaginative person, as I'm sure many of you are as well. And you can just probably think about walking into something like this, not expecting it and seeing it.
Well, and again, these are just kind of tales or legends. It's
Right.
not what actually happened.
That we
Um,
know of.
right. But I mean, if just an example, if someone's arm was broke so severely, it would have not, if they wouldn't have set it, it would have set itself in the fashion in which it was broken. So if she would have never treated them for their wounds, it could have been that, but in the retellings,
Right.
she was so sadistic that she set them in a certain way. Um, Now, there was a lot of aftermath in this, and she did eventually escape.
Yeah.
Now, what was the public outrage and mob reaction to all of this?
Well, so the public outrage was profound, actually. Despite the situation, the times in which many people had enslaved people, enslaved people or individuals, most of them didn't take a liking to the extreme abuse. So, for starters, the rescued, tortured slaves, when found, were taken to a local jail where they were put on display for the public to witness the injuries and sufferings of the individuals. Then there was the public condemnation by the media, specifically the New Orleans Bee, which stated that the atrocities were both barbarous and fiendish. As for the mob itself, basically an enraged crowd, after learning of the chained and mutilated slaves in the attic, stormed the mansion, demolishing everything that they could, including windows, furniture, and doors. And it was actually stated by a number of individuals that the damage by the mob was so severe that barely anything remained aside from the walls themselves.
All right. So now the question is,
Hmm.
what happened to Madame Laurie?
Yeah. And that's a fabulous question, right? Hopefully, we get justice. But sadly, that is not the case. So, of course, because of this outrage and subsequent destructive mob, Delphine and her family were forced to flee their home and they escaped to France. Now, again, unfortunately, she was never charged. She never had charges filed against her. No one came knocking on her door. However, at least one semi good thing that came out of it was that her reputation in the upper class society was completely destroyed, just basically non existent. Now, there have been some discrepancies around her death because she did eventually die, and it was, as far as we know, of normal causes. It's commonly believed that she died on December 7th of 1842, based on a gravestone that was found by Eugene Bex, um, or Bakes. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce that last name, but it was found by Eugene in the late 1930s, which supposedly read, Madame LaLaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarthy, died in Paris on December 7th of 1842 at the age of 6. And then that second number was illegible. No one knew. He didn't know how old she actually was. However, according to French archives of Paris, she supposedly died December 7th, which is accurate, but in 1849, so quite a few years later. And this was about 15 years after initially fleeing to France upon the findings in her New Orleans home.
Ugh.
Yeah. So it's unfortunate that she, in a sense got away. And there was um some stories that she had actually tried to come back to New Orleans. She wanted to move her family back, or at least go back herself at some point. But her children, a couple of her children who she had fled to France with, actually protested it and supposedly had changed her mind and kept her in France until her time had come and she had passed away. It's only sorry, it's really curious to know, like, if she had come back to New Orleans, what would have happened? Would people have recognized her? Would charges have been filed against her? Would she have been held accountable for her crimes? Or would she have kind of gotten through scot free regardless? Obviously, that is something we'll never know. But nonetheless, what we can hope is that there was eventually justice served, if not here in the living world, then hopefully in the afterlife, right? Um, Now, that brings us up, of course, to the one thing that we touched on at the very beginning of the show, and I'm sure what a lot of you are probably have been really waiting for even more so. But we always like to give the context of these historical locations before going into the hauntings themselves, because it helps, in my opinion, it helps us understand the hauntings,
Mhm.
and helps us to separate the fact and fiction of the hauntings themselves. So when it comes to the haunting, Justin, what have been the paranormal reports over the years?
Well, the one thing I really wanted to say, real quick is we do this with any paranormal investigation that we do. We want the history, whether that's of the house, of the paranormal activity itself, all three, um, mental health history of either the current occupants or previous or the ones that have passed away. So, I mean, that kind of solidifies why we do this the way we do it
Right.
is we are true paranormal investigators. We just don't do as much investigation now on, boots on the ground. Um, but the several of the reports here are of disembodied voices, or screams, even footsteps, and even the sound of a donkey braying. Um, People see apparitions walking about the building, including a large man in chains and a little girl. Poltergeist like activity in which objects move on their own, TVs turn on and off, and photos falling off of the walls, cold spots, the feeling of dread, which I mentioned, not really dread for me, just heaviness, but we did not get inside. So I might have felt that dread when I got in there. And even the smell of decay, which is kind of disgusting and gross.
Right. And it's, I always find like these hauntings which claim a smell of decay. And I think for the most part, we all kind of recognize what that means. But there's a number of different types of organic matter that decays. So it's like, are we talking about decaying bodies, decaying wood, decaying? It's like there are so many different distinct smells here. But in this case, I would imagine the sense of decay. They're talking about human
Like a dead
flesh.
body. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I would get from that. Yeah.
So a lot of this haunting is actually pretty common to pretty big hauntings, very popular, famous hauntings.
Hmm.
And considering the type of history that this mansion has, it would make sense that many of these things um, would be noticed by individuals, both paranormal investigators, but also just workers and normal individuals who happen to stop in and you know walk through or stay the night or whatever. But with that said, as with any location, there are always kind of two views or two interpretations of the haunting itself. So, what are the skeptic versus the believer interpretations of this particular haunting?
Well, this is the question to any haunting, really. But in terms of believers, it's often recognized that the torture conducted by LaLaurie likely left a psychic wound or residual energy that continually powers the haunting itself. We talk about it all the time. Many of the claimed phenomenon seem to be um, repeating a time in history rather than intelligently reacting to modern day um, tourists and investigators. However, because there have been claims of tourists and workers being scratched, it is argued that the haunting is kind of a split case of both, residual and intelligent hauntings. And again, we see this from to time in a haunting where you'll kind of have both. You'll have a screaming at midnight every night, and then you'll have just random words being said or your name being called and stuff like that.
Right. On top of like earlier, we had mentioned that there was supposedly a dark entity or a quote unquote demon in the 1890s that appeared, which, as we know, in many of these darker hauntings, some of these dark entities or these quote unquote evil entities, whatever they may be, demonic or otherwise, they tend to latch on to these particular locations because of the amount of depression and oppression within it already. They kind of feed off of it, and so they grow more powerful, and people start seeing these shadow-like things, right? And I'm not going to call them shadow people per se in this case. This is something much different, much heavier, much darker.
Right.
But nonetheless, there have been stories of this dark thing, this dark entity that has existed within this mansion since the 1890s. There haven't been any recent reports, but there have been claims of people seeing shadow-like figures within the home on occasion to this day.
Right. Now, with that said, the skeptics,
Mhm.
despite maintaining that abuse certainly did happen, often cite that many of the grotesque stories of mutilation, severed limbs, and medical experimentation on the slaves were either invented or highly exaggerated by the 19th and 20th century newspapers and books, of course. On top of that, it is believed that many of the reported hauntings, uh, I'm sorry, haunted sounds or feelings are likely misinterpreted by individuals due to the building's infamous reputation, and that many sounds, such as disembodied footsteps or thumping, is due to settling wood, shifting beams, or the intense humidity of the French Quarter causing structural movement on a 200-year-old building.
Right.
On top of that, the original story of the home has been distorted by pop culture, like we mentioned, including American Horror Story and ghost tours, which tend to prioritize a good story over historical accuracy. Then there's the belief of a smear campaign in which some research suggests that the initial horrific reports were heavily influenced by individuals, primarily neighbors, of course. Like we mentioned, she was in high society. They love rumors, and who had a strong dislike of LaLaurie. Now, we we see this a lot in hauntings that we have to debunk. So I have not seen if a paranormal investigative team has ever gone in there. I'm sure there probably has with these types of uh, recounts, but I haven't seen any of the TV shows that have done it, anyways.
Right. Well, that all kind of leads us up to one big question here, um, because despite the things that had happened in the house, and despite what believers believe, despite what skeptics believe, the main question now that's left is if, let's just say if, um, there are no actual spirits lingering around, like, it's not haunted by ghosts. Um, and yet this place still kind of seems haunted. Things are still happening. People are still witnessing things, seeing things, hearing things, etc., feeling things. Um, the question being, can a place be haunted, quote unquote, by trauma alone?
I mean, I think we've kind of already answered that. Yeah, it absolutely can, in my personal opinion. You see it in a lot of different places, not just the LaLaurie Mansion, but if you look at the Civil War battle uh, areas, people talk about hearing soldiers rushing, gunshots, stuff like that. A lot of war sites have these different sounds that are happening that you obviously couldn't hear in the distance. Like I highly doubt that there's people just firing off in the middle of the night at the Civil War
Right.
battles. So yes, and again, this is just personal opinion. Of course, we cannot 100% prove this, but in my opinion, yes, it can. And we see that with residual hauntings in homes as well.
Right. I when I think of the spirit of God, I often think and believe that the world and everything in it is endowed by the spirit. So everything has a spirit or a part of the spirit, including the materials that we use to build things, because that was created by God. It was spoken into existence, and as such, this building in and of itself kind of has a spirit. Not like we do. I'm not saying this is a living thing; it's an inanimate object, but I think there is a spiritual aura to it. And when you think of trauma, I like to liken that to trauma of individuals. And I'm not talking about the people who suffered in this case, but I'm thinking about people like us, you, me, our listeners. We all have trauma. We all have triggers, right? Somebody says something, boom, you're triggered. You get defensive, you get argumentative, you get, sad or depressed, fearful, whatever, right? And I think that just as we as human beings deal with trauma and working through that trauma, and we have these triggers, so too does that same type of trauma and triggers exist in these objects that are built around us. These buildings kind of absorb this energy of the brutality and the torture that had happened in this home, and it's become traumatized. It's like, you hear kind of this poetic saying every now and then, where it's like, if only the walls could speak, right? And I think there's some sort of truth to that, because I think the walls do, in its essence, absorb this energy, and then it replays it, and it's traumatized by what it experienced. And I know that sounds kind of far-fetched, it sounds kind of wacky and out there, even for some of you, but when you take the time to actually consider it, and take a moment to even consider that, yeah, it's possible that everything has a spirit, then of course there is the possibility that everything reacts just as our own spirits do. We know when there's bad energy, we know when there's bad mojo happening, right? we react to it. And I think the same thing here. So yeah, I think I do agree with you. I think that a haunting could be triggered by trauma alone, and this is a different type of trauma, but nonetheless very similar to human trauma.
Well, and just to add to that, I mean, super quick. I mean, we talk about crystals all the time, and that they have um, a resonance or a frequency or an energy to themselves, but they in of themselves are what most people would consider inanimate objects. Houses are made out of wood, which was once alive, and a lot of people even talk about how petrified wood has an energy and aura signature to it.
Right.
So absolutely, a house can absorb energy as much as what you would call have a spirit, quote unquote. So maybe it's not so much having a spirit or uh, having a haunting, but absorbing energy, and that is what a lot of these residual hauntings are.
Could be. Could be.
Um, so some final questions here to really consider, and Eric, you can absolutely give your opinion on this. Um, you know, at what point does history cross into rumors or horrors?
Um, I think that history kind of crosses over into horror or the horrors when it becomes starts to become exaggerated. People start to hang on to these stories, start to share them from one generation to another, and you start to see these things grow, which is often the case. Right? When many of these stories, especially from early on, one or two things happen: they grow, or they wither away and die. And when they grow, in this case, they become more horrific, and they kind of become these horror stories for us. And that's what we come back, and obviously, like we enjoy it. Like people go on the ghost tours, hoping to see this mansion, come across it, hear what happened. We're kind of drawn to it in a way.
And yeah, I agree with that 100%, especially when you start when people start writing stories and it crosses into pop culture and TV shows and movies and video games, stuff like that. It The history gets distorted drastically. So yeah, I agree with that. Now, we have talked about this numerous times about doing the investigation at Jeffrey Dahmer's family home.
Mm.
But just like that, is the LaLaurie mansion haunted, or is just the story itself is what unsettles us, or even causes people to have these haunting like effects?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. I wish I can, because I think you can agree with me on this, and I wish I can come up with something that would like kind of put some differentiation between you and I. But the truth is, I think that it's a little of both. I think that the LaLaurie Mansion is indeed haunted. By what and by who, I can't say. Um, but based on the stories and the amount of evidence from those stories, I could assume pretty accurately that it's probably haunted, at least residually by various individuals who had passed away there, or at least by the torture and horrific energy that was manifested during the time in the 1800s. Um, but I also think that the story does really unsettle us, especially the modern stories, because some of these things are so grotesque, as you guys heard earlier. Uh, People hold on to this, and that energy is then, you know, pushed into the mansion, especially as we have ghost tour after ghost tour after ghost tour passing through this. You're telling these stories, people are pushing their energy onto this location, and it's just growing and it's becoming stronger. So yeah, I think it's a little of both, and it's what keeps us up at night, honestly.
Yeah. And I think when we did the investigation there, we went into it knowing the history of Jeffrey Dahmer, and
Mhm.
that will freak you out for sure. And
Oh
knowing
yeah,
what happened there,
yeah.
uh,
I mean, like going underneath the house where I knew he chopped up and separated the bones and the flesh of Stephen Hicks. It's a completely different feeling from going under a house and not knowing what happens there.
right,
It's terrifying.
right. Um, Now, why do places tied to real cruelty feel more disturbing than fictional hauntings or even just fiction in general, fictional cruelty?
I think because it's straightforward as the question puts it. It's real. It's just real. Like the amount of Stephen King books I've read over the past couple of years have rarely affected me the way that reality does. And mind you, like some things in reality aren't nearly as grotesque or disturbing as the things that Stephen King writes, but
Right.
fiction is separated from, and I'm not saying that fiction can't be scary, right? I mean, I had a nightmare about Pennywise the clown chasing me down 2 nights ago. So I woke up terrified and I had to shut and lock my door to feel better and fall asleep. Um, so, but with that said, I think the fact that real cruelty does exist, it's this idea that we can, as people who didn't go through such circumstances as some of these enslaved people did in the 1800s, we being human can, at the very least, sympathize with what they had gone through. We can kind of imagine the pain and the suffering that they must have endured, and that's what becomes disturbing. It's knowing that this could happen to anybody at any time, depending on obviously the situation. And when it's fiction, again, you're just looking at a story. You're looking at characters that don't really exist, and so it's easier to bypass some of those tellings versus the reality of our history, especially like around the world. I was especially here in this case in America with some of the things that happen in Louisiana and the South in general, but just around the world, right? This is a terrible place we live in sometimes.
Well, and to kind of add to that, I think uh, the majority of the population want to believe that regular human beings are not capable of the cruelty and horrors that happened in this particular case at the LaLaurie Mansion. But even more so, like, that's why a lot of monster stories or monsters that we know today have kind of come about is because people don't want to believe that humans are capable of tearing somebody apart or, completely mauling a person. Um,
Right.
that's not to say that I don't believe that some of these monsters do exist because I do. But yeah, that's kind of my take on it
Well,
too is
yeah,
some humans become monsters just from the retellings of it all.
right. Well, 100%. Like, I mean, you think of Vlad the Impaler, you think of Elizabeth Bathory. These are people who would put one person. Vlad would put people on spikes while alive. In very disturbing and horrifying ways, and these people would survive for days on end. And he would eat in front of them and have meals while these people's blood would fall into the ground. Elizabeth Bathory, she was a serial killer who killed a multitude of young women and young girls and bathed in their blood. And in both cases, they have grown into this vampiric type creatures in lore. People often claim them to be vampires, but in reality, both Vlad and Elizabeth Bathory were just humans who did the unthinkable, did something so horrifying that the only way to really wrap our minds around it was to turn them into literal monsters that we would read in fictional books.
Well, and I mentioned this earlier that Coven I'm pretty sure mixed two historical characters together because in Coven, LaLaurie bathes in the blood of the slaves that she is torturing or even killing,
Yeah,
where I don't believe in history it was actually the case.
right.
So that I was a little upset about that part of it, but it is fiction, so they didn't stick to all of the facts, of course.
Right.
Not to mention LaLaurie was not immortal either. Um, so biggest question,
Yeah.
should some buildings be preserved or erased? So many historical sites have been saved, but should they have just been torn down?
I think it's completely dependent on the situation of the property. Um, I think in a case like this, uh, it's important to preserve. the location in order to preserve the historical context of the times and help tell the stories of the individuals who were harmed and who had lost their lives in it. It's a way to keep modern people aware of our past so that we don't make those same mistakes going forward as humans. With that said, if a location is, in this case, regarding a haunting, is so dark, is so, dare I say, evil that it's actually causing harm to the people who work there, live there, who visit there. Like I'm talking physical harm, mental harm, emotional harm, spiritual harm. If it's that bad, then yes, I think those buildings should be erased, or at the very least have very strong precautions from keeping people from entering the property, if indeed you're going to still keep it as a historical preserved building. Otherwise, yeah, I think it should be destroyed if people are actually being harmed because of the manifestation of energy and spirits that are currently existing there.
But I mean, couldn't it even be said that, destroying the property wouldn't necessarily destroy the spirits or entities that are there?
I mean, that's we can't prove that. We cannot prove that. It would
Right.
completely. Yeah, I mean, in one case you can say yes. There's an argument that if we destroy, we dig up a grave site, an old burial ground that had a haunting, and then we put a house there, that house will still be haunted by whatever used to exist there. And yes, that is very possible. There have been instances in which that is the case, but there are also instances in which there were houses built on burial grounds or on cemeteries that don't have those hauntings. Nothing's happening. So I think it does depend on the situation. In some cases, get rid of the physical aspect of it, and the spiritual disappears as well. If there's no place for those entities to haunt, then there's no place for that entity to haunt. It's like erasing the home of an entity or of a spirit. But I will say that that's different from a residual haunting, which would never know the building existed there in the first place, whether it was physical or not.
Right.
So, anyway, with all that said, we are not kind of, we're very much at the end of this episode. Um, Regarding everything we talked about here, do you have any kind of final thoughts on the LaLaurie Mansion and the history behind it?
Um, Really, just especially with the current state we're in the world right now, learn from history.
Yeah.
Don't let history repeat itself. And when it comes to like hauntings and stuff like that, um, obviously know the history of the location that you're at, but do not let it influence your your findings or even trying to debunk something, because you can know the history, start hearing these things going on, and get wrapped up in the moment and kind of taint the investigation by doing that. So,
Yeah. Couldn't say it better myself. So, with that said, folks, we are going to wrap up here. Next week, we have with us a special guest, Vincent Genna. We're going to be talking about the truth behind extraterrestrials. You know how much we love talking about extraterrestrials. So, and we know how much you guys love hearing about it. So, definitely tune in for that show. As always, it'll be at 10 p.m. on Tuesday night, 10 p.m. Eastern, by the way. But with that said, we are going to wrap out of here. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Please be sure to like, follow, subscribe, all the jazz with YouTube, with Spotify, iHeart, and anywhere else you find our podcast and podcasts in general. Um, as I said at the beginning of this episode, this has been a live show on 107.7 FM New Orleans, 105.3 FM the Gulf Coast, and the United Public Radio Network. So until next week, where you'll find us at the same time and on the same channel, my name is Erik.
yeah, I'm Justin.
Peace.